Hello and welcome back to my Let's Play of Final Fantasy III. I want to thank everyone who tuned in last week to watch part 1 of my Let's Play. I hope you got some enjoyment out of it, and I hope you'll get just as much enjoyment out of part 2 here. We'll be naming Terra soon, and also be introduced to the lovable treasure hunter Locke. My old sweetheart. I want to take a moment to talk about the amnesia trope in RPGs. It's a tired and used trope. I'm not sure if it was as used by this point when Final Fantasy III first came out to the States, but it has been used a lot. I think the biggest examples I can think of is Final Fantasy V and Xenogears. Two really great games, by the way, and I may check them out at some point. I have a huge backlog I want to get through on this channel, so I'm not about to run out of content anytime soon. I always thought it was an interesting trope if done correctly. The mystery and intrigued of a character who doesn't know their own past and don't know how to shape their future. It's compelling storytelling 101. I also personally always wondered what it would be like to have chunks of my past lost to me. Not something I would ever want to experience, but something I've wondered about. As we'll see in this video, Terra is a very powerful magic user. I can't really measure how strong she is compared to other Final Fantasy characters like Cloud and Squall, but most of the main cast of Final Fantasy games would probably be first-class soldiers at best if they were in Final Fantasy VII. With all they've been through after all, Terra is just a woman who wants to learn about love. That's relatable to a lot of us. I'm just going to name all the characters their default names. I never saw the point after becoming a teenager to name characters' original names, when they act a certain way, and their default names are their canon names anyway. More power to you if you enjoy naming your characters in the old RPGs, it's just not for me. Looking back at this game, I have to say that it has aged very well. Unlike the very poor re-release on Android several years back, which just killed the character sprites. Though it did awesome with the monster and summon artwork. I never played it on that device. I've briefly played both the PlayStation 1 and Game Boy Advance versions, and while many fans claim the Game Boy Advance version is the more faithful translation of the game, I just can't help but adore and love the original Super Nintendo version the best. Even despite all its translation errors and flaws. I just can't stand to play any other version. As much as I love Final Fantasy III, it's actually not a hard game to beat. If you level up too early, it can become ridiculously easy to wreck everything in front of you. While on games like Final Fantasy VII and VIII, people say just press X to win. In this case, just press it to win. By the way, the X on the PlayStation controller isn't an X, it's a cross. The other buttons are shapes, so think about it for a moment. We've just been programmed to call the cross a X because it looks like one, and the earlier controllers were all based off letters. My partner and daughter says hi, by the way. I married the love of my life back in 2012. And we've been happily married for 12 years now. We adopted our daughter 8 years ago as a baby, so she's now 8 years old and coming along nicely. Our dog is 2 years old. We live the simple life, but it's enough for me. Anyway, back to the game. I think out of the ensemble cast, Locke is my favorite to use. And I used to heavily ship him with Seals after a couple of playthroughs of the game. At least once I was done shipping him with myself. Now I'm mainly keeping these videos short, while not too short. I find a good length between 10 to 15 minutes to be a good base for just starting out. At least until there's a demand to make them longer, and I doubt that's going to happen, as I'm pretty sure few people are going to watch these until I get several videos into this channel. That's okay. It's a learning and growing process, and Rome wasn't built in a day. At least that gives me plenty of time to improve my editing skills and video creation process, and I have no idea how many parts this game is going to be, as it's a long game. As was par for the course in RPGs games. Nowadays almost every game is long, with the exception of things like shooters and sports games. I don't think I said this in the last video, but among my favorite genres are RPGs, Survivor Horror, and Metroid Castlevania. Those are the genres I enjoy the most out of any other genre. There are other genres I'll venture into occasionally. My partner got me into beat-em-ups early on in my gaming hobby. And fighters. When I was a little girl, I used to watch WCW Monday Nitro with my dad every Monday evening, so I had a couple of WCW games growing up as well. I never got into WWE. As soon as Nitro went off the air in 2001, I stopped watching wrestling. I hear Rey Mysterio and Chris Jericho are still around. And Sting just retired. But that's the limit of what I know about that genre. Things were very different in the gaming world when I was a kid. Story was more of a novelty than a requirement. Most games focused on difficulty, level designs, and gameplay. It was the RPGs or adventure games like Zelda that focused more on story and world building. Games like Mario, Mega Man, etc. had little to no story. Though some games were starting to get more story as time went on. The Mortal Kombat games, for instance, actually had a lot of story tied to them, but back then, we didn't care. We just wanted to bust people up and make them bleed. Street Fighter was another fighter that had a lot of story, but most people were in it for the fighting. Even Final Fantasy games didn't start out with telling a good, compelling story with character development. The first game had a premise, but the characters were more customable and had no personalities. You had to name those characters, as they had no default names back then. It wasn't until the original Final Fantasy II that story and characters became more important, and they kinda went back and forth in which number game focused on story or gameplay. With 1 it was the gameplay. 2 had more focus on story, and was a rather interesting one for being such an early title. 3 was about difficulty and a job system. 4 was about story and added a lot of the staples that would be used in later games. Then, after that, they focused more and more on story. And to Square's credit, they always managed to make a good, compelling story for their worlds, and they always shook things up each entry to remain relevant and keep the franchise going. That's most likely why Final Fantasy is still going on even today. Even if it's not as popular as it once was. Though to be fair, outside of Final Fantasy VII, the games were never in the mainstream. They were a niche from beginning to now. The RPG niche. It's now that part of the video where I'll politely ask if you enjoyed this video, then smash that like button and show me some love. I'll also provide some topics for the comment section, though I really don't expect to get any comments for a while. Here's a topic: talk about what you think of the current state of Final Fantasy. Has it fallen from grace over the years, or do you still think it's as great as it always has been? Even in the past, people were hating on the newer games, that many of us now consider classics, so I don't take much salt in the game bashing that people do online. People will never be satisfied, and just always need something to complain about. They're entitled to their opinions, but still. Sometimes a game is just a game. In the last video I talked about the confusing renumbering system that they abandoned by Final Fantasy VII. Now I want to talk about how confusing it would have been for Western and Eastern fans had they kept renumbering them. 7 would have been 4, 8 would have been 5, 9 would have been 6, and 10 would have been 7. When people from Japan talked about their favorite games, Western audiences would be thinking of an entirely different game and be confused. And I can tell you from experience that the East and West are as alienated from each other enough without that kind of confusion. Japan is a very different country and culture from us, and Japanese developers have been suffering in understanding their Western audiences for years. Somehow Square can't seem to comprehend that their old style of the turn-based RPG system never went out of style, and that it's still a niche with some demand. Instead, they modernized everything and make it more action-based than in previous games. But that has been happening since, I believe, Final Fantasy X-2. Also, I never got upset that Final Fantasy XV had an all-male playable cast. We got an all-female playable cast with X-2, so it was only fair that the boys would have their all-male cast. I never understand the big deal in that. There have been playable women in Final Fantasy games for years, and there will be for years to come. And there were still female characters in the game, so it's not like it was a total sausage fest. But it goes back to what I said before. Some people just want to complain. I think in a lot of the past games, Square had a rule of 3 when it came to Final Fantasy games. I forget if that rule began with 3 here, because the only playable female characters I remember clearly are Terra and Seals. That's kind of bad when I can't remember all of the characters for as many times as I have played this as a kid. But like I said in the previous video, it has been so long that some things are a blur to me, while others are clear in my mind. Final Fantasy III also had a lot of mini-games and experimental stuff that made it stand out from its predecessors and other games of its era. Like how when we get to the Moogles here, you can switch between 3 to 4 characters and move them to intercept enemies, taking out each enemy and keeping them from reaching their designation before heading to the final boss of that section. That was something that always stuck with me in this game. And I think there will be more areas like that in the future. And then there's the opera segment. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I also really like the music of Final Fantasy III. Of course, almost all the Final Fantasy games have fantastic soundtracks, 3 being no exception. My favorite being the song that played on the title screen and later plays in the final boss fight with Kefka. Kefka also has some of the best quotes in any video game I've played. The way everything ties together in the end is just amazing, and kept me on the edge of my seat as a kid. Imagine being a little girl, putting this game in for the first time, knowing nothing about it or Final Fantasy or RPGs, and everything that the game throws at you. Needless to say, it shaped a considerable part of my childhood, and when I finally beat it, I felt accomplished. Like I had just done the impossible. I was determined to see the conclusion of the story, and what would happen to the characters, and I almost cried when it was over. Okay, it's time to wrap this video up. Thanks for spending your day with me, and please feel free to watch my previous video if you haven't already, as it will get you caught up for the third. See you soon.